As you've heard, Robert K. Merton and Robert C. Merton were father and son. They were also remarkably close. They talked by phone every day for decades. In order to keep the two Bobs straight for all of you, Svi and I have decided to call them RKM and RCM, but I confess that it's kind of hard for me to talk about my husband as RKM and about Bob as RCM. So if I get it tangled, you'll understand. According to RCM, their calls dealt with his work and his father's work, with the stock market, with sports, politics, their children, as RCM put it, about nearly everything. This essay touches on one aspect, as you've just heard, which is the influence of RKM on RCM when RCM was growing up, on his research, and as a medley of stories I'll tell will reveal. You know who the man on the right is? That's RKM. Not all of you are going to be familiar with who he was. To locate RKM chronologically, he was born in 1910, died in 2003. He was arguably the most significant sociologist of the last half of the 20th century. He was a theorist and he did empirical research. He examined a vast variety of subjects. Svi and I have encountered his papers and books. He would have objected to that crude numerical indicator. But his bibliography covers some 15 closely printed pages. It ranges over the sciences, social sciences, and humanities. But RCM could say that although my research is very mathematical, very quantitative, and seemingly very far away from what my father did, nonetheless, I found myself using many of his ideas. RCM has drawn on RKM's concept. See, where's the rest of this? Okay, many of RKM's concepts. He was the founder of the associate. This part we'll get to. At any rate, RCM has written in his publications and spoken about his father's ideas of manifest and latent functions, functions and dysfunctions, unanticipated consequences, functions and structures, which RCM calls institutions. In both his teaching and in the papers that Svi have done on a functional perspective on the finance system. These papers lay out the principal concepts needed for understanding how the financial system works. In that sense, these papers aren't altogether different from RKM's paradigm for functional analysis. Paradigm, I might add, was a notion he used about 10 to 15 years before Tom Kuhn made it so popular. RKM was also known for his studies of bureaucracy, crime, and its origins, the effects of mass communications and propaganda, the effect of communities on their residents, and the professions, as Vanessa knows. This list is just the tip of his research iceberg. He was the father of the sociology of science, now a full-grown specialty, but one which didn't even exist when he wrote his doctoral dissertation on the role Puritanism played in the establishment of modern science. He was especially interested in the implications and the effects of the emphasis in science on priority, on being first, on making a discovery before anyone else. And he went on to lay out both its positive and negative consequences, functions, so to speak. We all know that scientists don't always agree on who made a discovery first. And that absence of agreement has led to conflicts over priority, to very dark feelings among scientists who are participants in such discoveries, who have not rarely gotten into open conflict, and sometimes to make claims of plagiarism against against the person who is in competition with them, and even to claim that fraud exists. Some of you may have heard of the Matthew effect. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand. That was RKM's analysis of how it is that well-known scientists tend to get more than their fair share of recognition. It's not simply that the wealthy get wealthier, not at all. What he was saying was that they get disproportionately wealthier for the contributions they make that are more or less equivalent in the contribution to knowledge of their less advantaged co-discoverers. One other tack altogether, as Peter Dougherty knows, RKM's last book was on serendipity in science and how it came to be that scientists made discoveries they never even intended to make. That gives you a sense of the breadth of his interests. Those of you who don't know who he was certainly know about his ideas. They have so penetrated the public mind that it's simply hard to escape reading the front page of the New York Times without one of them. He is the originator of the concept of role models, of unanticipated consequences, of self-fulfilling prophecies, of influentials, of bureaucratic personalities. These for starters. These phenomena did not exist. It's very important you understand that in the collective mind until he had the wit to perceive that they were phenomena, to analyze why they occur, and to create evocative terms for them. He was university professor at Columbia for 50 years. He received both the Presidential Medal of Science and the American Council of Learned Societies Award for Distinguished Scholarship in the Humanities, both ends of the continuum of scholarship. A member of the US National Academy of Sciences, the British Academy, the Royal Swedish Academy, the American Philosophical Society, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He received over 30 honorary degrees from Oxford, Bologna, Rome, Leiden, Krakow, Hebrew University, and Athens, and in the United States from Harvard, Yale, Chicago, and Columbia, of course. His work has been continuously cited, and it's continuously influential. And as you know, he was the very proud father of Robert C. Merton. Now, before Sri and I plunge in, we have a confession to make. We're very biased with respect to our two subjects. Svi was our CM student and has worked with him for 45 years, and they continue to collaborate. Svi also knew RKM and liked and admired him, and RKM liked and admired Svi too. For my part, over some 40 years, RKM was my teacher, collaborator, and ultimately my partner and husband. You'd be right to think that I'm biased too. And add to this that when I married RKM, I happily acquired RCM as a stepson. So I too am doubly biased. Now, at the same time, we're both card-carrying social scientists. We're obliged to keep our biases under control. And we'll try to tell the story of the influence of RKM on RCM as it was then and as it is now. It remains active. Now, personal influence is a complicated business. We're inclined to think that similarities between father and son arise from one influencing the other. But of course, influence is more complicated than that. It is easy to assume that similarities in question wouldn't have existed without some active effort. But that's not necessarily so. We'll not get into the weeds of determining how the influence occurred, or even who influenced whom. Rather, we've elected to draw upon RCM's testimony about his father, and in an interview we did with him several weeks ago. But of course, such testimony is unreliable. As RCM reminded us and himself, skepticism about the validity of memories, some of them more than 50 years old, actually a lot more than that, RCM, are particularly vulnerable. RCM also noted that what he assumed at the time his father thought or believed also might not have been right. So we have a problem of validity here. It was helpful, though, for Svi and me to be able to draw on RKM's copious files, some going back to when RCM was a small boy. The great majority of materials we drew on, though, came in a set of file folders labeled Bob, unhelpfully filed under the letter B. We were very lucky to find this file. We read an accumulation of letters, faxes, manuscripts, clippings, invitations that were exchanged between them in 1994. That 1 year's file measured between 9 and 10 inches thick. And this was before, well, it wasn't before, and this didn't even include emails, of which there are no copies, Bob. But it was before Bob got the Nobel and after his options pricing work, so the subject of that particular year were not wildly wildly unrepresentative. We also drew on knowledge that both Svi and I had of the work of the two of them, just in case we missed similarities which hadn't surfaced otherwise. Now, we call this section before RCM became the financial economist. According to RCM, his father, RKM, was no tiger father. I was struck at the time when you said this, how contemporaneous a term that was, but no tiger father is very clear. RKM never insisted that RCM read specific books, never insisted he pursue certain activities, never told him to study harder or to get better grades. In fact, his grades were uneven. And he never told him that certain ideas should be adopted and others rejected. According to RCM, his father's child-rearing policy, if there was one, relied almost entirely on example. His father liked to read and read a lot. There were lots of books around the house, including a large number of dictionaries. Judging from what I knew about RKM's personal library, lots of books clearly meant thousands. RCM said that when he was a child, he liked dipping into those dictionaries. He also liked looking at his father's old books. He liked going to the local library with his father, but the two of them never read together. Despite being bookish, RKM was no literary snob. He read detective stories and mysteries, as well as novels, biographies, histories, essays, and poetry, and everything he thought might be germane to his work. And he often returned to the Bible, Old and New Testament, of course. RCM does not describe himself as bookish, but books were a part of his life. The emphasis is his. Now, there were three activities RKM deliberately introduced to RCM: magic or sleight of hand, poker, and the stock market. RKM's enthusiasm for magic goes back to his teenage years, when he mastered sleight of hand well enough to be paid to perform. Magic, however, for RCM was a total loss, as he put it. He recalls standing in front of the mirror, trying to learn the moves his father had learned decades before. That effort was tedious and frustrating. He decided then that there was no comparative advantage, a concept he must have had as a child, to justify the effort. Magic held no magic for him. Not so for poker and the market. RCM took up poker earlier. As far as I know, he didn't play with RKM very much after RCM had mastered the game, which he evidently did by his teenage years. We take seriously Paul Samuelson's testimony that RCM routinely emptied out the pockets of any and all fellow students who played with him. He later went on to play in far more challenging games with far richer players. RKM's introduction of RCM to the stock market suited RCM's very early interest in money. As a child, he balanced his mother's checkbook. He also founded, and you'll love this, I do, the RCM Savings Bank of Dollars and Cents, as he called it. He sought deposits from family and friends, which, when they reached a certain level, he and his mother would deposit in the local savings bank. He then paid depositors somewhat less than what he had earned, thus becoming a sort of second-order banker. But it was the stock market that really intrigued him. Even before he was 10, his father took him to the local brokerage house in White Plains. They watched the ticker together, and they talked about the prospects of particular stocks. During these visits, RCM says he soaked up a lot of market lore. It's not clear when he learned all the ticker tape abbreviations for the stocks listed on the American and the New York exchanges. That must have started earlier. In any event, he learned about convertible bonds from one of the other men that frequented the brokerage house. He learned about the risks of excessive leveraging from another. He recalled that this man who was the ultimate leverager earned a lot and lost a lot, so much in 1 year that he had to borrow money for Christmas presents. This clearly deeply impressed RCM, who we know would later go on to be highly sensitive to investment risk. RCM made his first stock purchase when he was 10, and he undertook his first risk arbitrage at about 15. He was lucky that worked out. He had no idea that maybe the merger he anticipated wouldn't go through. By the time he was a college student at Columbia, he was a sophisticated investor. And by the time he got to Caltech as a graduate student, he was getting up early, well before his classes began, to trade on the markets that were already open in the East. One might think that this immersion in the market would have led him to consider a career as a trader or something of that sort, but it didn't. He says it never occurred to him that his interest in investing could lead to its becoming a day job. Nor did it occur to him, given his relationship with his father, to become a professor. Based on observations he made of one of his father's colleagues, he decided that professors were arrogant and people he wanted nothing to do with. He excluded his father from this observation, he said recently. He said his father was a gem, different from the rest. During his second semester at Caltech, RCM decided that he wasn't really interested in being an applied mathematician. Instead, he thought of going to graduate school in economics. It's but now a famous story that he was rejected by all the graduate departments to which he applied, but one, MIT, which also awarded him a fellowship. In his talk at RCM's 50th birthday party here at MIT, Paul Samuelson put it to rest that academic nepotism explained RCM's admission to MIT. No one responsible for admissions at MIT, Paul said, had any idea that the RCM from Caltech had any relationship with RKM from Columbia. Well, so much for paternal influences. Now to the functional perspective on the financial system. RKM
Harriet is very modest, so she doesn't want to explain the financial concepts that Bob Merton invented, developed. I did my best to put, let's call them, his greatest hits. These are just a few. First of all, the 6 functions of any financial system. I will not go through all 6, but they form the basis for a lot of the work that he's done and that we've done together. Synthesis of neoclassical transaction cost and behavioral paradigms. We don't see a conflict. Well, it started with him, and of course, he convinced me rather easily that there really is no conflict between the behavioral approach and the neoclassical approach. In the neoclassical approach to finance, there are no institutions. It's individuals transacting directly in markets. And you get some fantastic, very powerful results from that. However, in order for it to actually come about in the real world, institutions have to develop and implement those things. And we tried our hand at a synthesis of the approach, and I think that's a major contribution. The notion of the risk balance sheet, the fact that in studying financial institutions, and in fact any firm, any organization, just as important as the balance sheet, which shows at a point in time the value of assets and liabilities, one has to think in terms of exposure to risk or changes in the balance sheet items. And Bob developed an approach based on option pricing theory, or its extension, contingent claims analysis. I'll just say that term once and leave it at that. But today it's known as, in academic circles, it's known as contingent claims analysis. the financial innovation spiral, the idea that institutions are constantly changing and products move from institutions where they typically are innovated to markets, and then that's when they become more homogeneous, and then from markets with homogeneous products, new institutions can develop, and it's kind of a spiral moving up, sometimes collapsing. Crises occur periodically, but fundamentally, there's an upward movement over time. Contingent claims equivalence to dynamic replication. Now that probably sounds like gobbledygook to many of you, but the basic idea here is the fundamental insight that comes from option pricing theory, namely that using basic instruments, in the case of stock options, it's stock and risk-free bonds, to replicate the payoffs from other contracts, in particular stock options. And that gives you a theory of the production of new financial instruments. And it also gives you a price, because the arbitrage principle, or no arbitrage principle, says the option price has to be equal to the cost of replicating the option dynamically in that fashion. Now, that's a very powerful principle. And in fact, Bob once said to me that in his first meeting, the first presentation he made while still a graduate student, the great Ken Arrow came up to him afterwards. This was a seminar where many of the greats of economic theory were present, Harvard, MIT. And Bob, at the age, I guess you were 26 years old or some 25 years old, Ken Arrow came over to him and said, you know, it occurred to me that that might be the case, that by trading dynamically, you don't have to have complete markets for all contingencies. But unfortunately, Ken didn't have the same mathematical apparatus that Bob introduced to finance theory. Customers versus investors in financial firms, very important principle for understanding the evolution of financial institutions. When one buys an insurance policy, one, as a customer, you don't want to be exposed to default risk of the institution. So investors have to put up risk capital in order to satisfy the demand of the customers. Now that may seem rather obvious, but in the theory of financial institutions, it's nowhere to be found until Bob introduced it. So we'll leave it at that, and now I turn it back to Harriet.
Svi has just saved me. I had no idea he was going to pull me out of the depths, but all I can say is that this is just not my world. And I think I got most of the words, but none of the music. What I can tell you is that even though RCM thinks it's presumptuous to identify ways in which he and Svi extended his father's views on functional analysis, I can say as an outsider who knows more about the RKM side of that, they did extend his views. They in many ways, by looking very closely at one system, clarified a number of ideas, just for example, that functions are far less changeable than institutions are. Now, RKM certainly, being a structural functional analyst, paid a lot of attention to structures, but he hadn't, because that wasn't what his objective was, he hadn't really thought through which was more flexible than the other. And I had a page on the innovations that RCM and SVI made in the RKM functional analysis paradigm, but I'm not going to expose you to it. The ideas, their ideas, are and were very powerful. I am quite sure that RKM would have applauded those extensions. By no means would he have objected to them. As you'll hear, extending his ideas was something he cared a lot about. Now, did RCM and his father differ in some respects? Yes, they did. But RCM believes that the differences were more a matter of degree than of kind. Now, what did RKM think about the functional perspective on the financial system? SVI reported to me that RKM was very impressed. He thought it might be still another major contribution. But he asked SVI whether these ideas were new. He was very concerned that they not be repetitions of anybody else's work. He was worried already about the priority of discovery. Now, in this section, and I think I still got some time, RKM often mentioned wanting to publish with each of his offspring. In fact, he and his lawyer daughter, Vanessa, did publish together in 1983 on a paper that dealt with the ambivalence that clients experience when they seek professional help from strangers. Half seriously, RKM also mentioned wanting to publish with RCM and Bob Solow, so that the authorship could read Robert Merton Solo and Robert Merton Duo. Alas, that paper never materialized. But I understand that Bob Solow liked the idea. In the 1990s, RCM and RKM decided seriously to work together. On a paper that would deal with the reward system of science. That is, on how it affects the choices scientists make among research problems. Their plan was to discover the conditions under which the reward system, which gives scientists incentives to work on important and hard problems, more than it does for them to work on important but easy problems. But the question is, how do scientists actually make these choices? What they were doing was making problem choice a problem choice, a telling case of what RKM called self-exemplification in science. Svi, where is the paper?
It's come.
It comes, okay. Nope, nope, nope.
There it is.
Nope. Anyway, we don't have that paper. It was there before, but there it is. This is the first page of a 40-page paper that Svi and I have in hand. The idea behind it was that our CM would produce mathematical models of choice of problems, and our KM would provide his vast knowledge of the reward system and concrete cases of instances of RCM's conditions. Now, RCM did what he was supposed to do. He worked through models of problem choice under 2 conditions and had plans for 2 more. The 2 talked about the paper daily. According to RCM, his father understood the mathematics, and he also liked the outcomes of the models. This 40-page paper shows no signs of RKM's very identifiable writing style. It bristles with equations. When we mentioned this to RCM, he said, well, of course, I wrote it. Now, RKM must have mentioned the paper to his former student, James Coleman. By this time, Jim Coleman was a very distinguished sociologist, and he was the doyen of mathematical sociology. He was also the editor of a journal called Rational Choice Theory, and he accepted the paper immediately. But it wasn't ever published. Why was this? RKM had a history of withdrawing completed and accepted manuscripts from publication. Almost always, the reason he gave for doing this was he didn't think the work was good enough. Now, was this the case here? RCM thinks not. He said RKM thought the results of the models were illuminating. RCM believes, and it strikes me as being probably true, not probably true, that his father didn't think he had contributed enough to merit authorship. The paper remains unpublished. As far as we know, no published equivalent exists. RCM has left the door open to future publication. He might return to it sometime. Now we return to another episode of RCM and RKM's joint life. We come to the simultaneous publication of Black-Scholes on the pricing of options and corporate liabilities, and of RCM's theory of rational options pricing. These are papers very likely to be familiar to you. You know from Peter Bernstein's engaging book, Capital Ideas, that RCM put the brakes on publication of his paper on option pricing to make sure it came out at the same time that Black-Scholes did. Now I'm going to quote from a longish email that RCM sent us. As you know, Fisher, Black, and Myron worked together on the options pricing problem, and I worked on it alone. In friendly competition, Myron shared some of what they were doing with me occasionally. All my technical work and much more was done by December 1970. When I distributed an MIT working paper, I created a narrower version called The Rational Theory of Option Pricing as an MIT working paper in 1971. Fisher and Myron were trying to get their paper published in the Journal of Political Economy. It was initially rejected, but by this time, it had the strong support from Merton Miller and Jean Fama. However, resistance to publishing it continued on the basis that it was too specialized and because finance, and certainly options, were not mainstream or important in economics. Again, this is RCM talking. I was approached by Paul McAvoy, my Sloan economics colleague, who had been named as editor of the newly created Bell Journal of Economics, with an offer to publish any paper I wanted, with as much space as I wanted, and rapid publication, and $500. My MIT salary at the time was something like $11,000. Well, actually, Peter Bernstein says it was $11,500. I'd agreed to do it, but I imposed the condition that McAvoy could not publish the paper until I gave the okay. Now, here's the point of the story. I knew from being around my dad that if my paper came out with a 1971 imprint or 1972, and Myron's and Fisher's came out later, as it did in 1973, my paper would have been given the edge, that is, priority. Even if I wrote in the opening credits that my result could not have been done without theirs. Without their insights, my work would not have been the same. Although I derived the results in a different fashion, and in my opinion, my assumptions were considerably more general. When I found out when their paper would appear, I notified the Bell Journal, and both papers came out at the same time in the spring of 1973. The following should be in boldface in Bob's email to us. I am pretty sure that without the sensitivity that my dad instilled in me, I would have just published the paper. It's notable that when Black-Scholes published their paper, they published their derivation and mine as two ways. They did insert a footnote that gave me credit for the second way. Without that little note, maybe no Nobel, who knows? Did RCM regret having delayed publication? No. In fact, he said he sleeps better at night for having done so. Now, RKM was clearly standing in the wings of this drama. How much fatherly advice did RKM actually give RCM? The documents we've seen show the generally restrained RKM didn't shrink from responding when RCM asked for help. RCM did ask for his father's editorial assistance on his non-technical papers. He sought advice on dealing with publishers, and early on what to charge for consulting. This was well before he became far more experienced at it than his father was. In each of these instances, RKM was in his element. We'll describe only his propensity to edit other people's work. He made it tighter logically, more graceful, and with some frequency, added good ideas the authors originally didn't have. It was said, in my world, that he performed literary alchemy, that he turned written dross into publishable gold. Now, let's see if I can go back here. I want to show you the manuscript there. How much of this you can see? You can see the river of red ink. This is what happened always to people who gave their manuscripts to RKM to edit. Now, RKM thought that RCM wrote well. He said as much often. But he could not restrain his sharp red pen from commenting on all matter, from the historical antecedents of the subject of the paper, to the grammar, to the felicity of the presentation. You gave a paper to RKM, this is what you got back. Now, we know that RKM edited RCM's Nobel lecture. He acknowledged as much in the paper itself. I wish we had that document, but we don't. This is the best we have. Now, according to RCM, they also were alike in a particular speech habit. They both liked to digress. After making a statement, each would veer off into a verbal footnote, which then got its own verbal footnote, and then that footnote got a third footnote, leaving listeners anxious anxiously wondering, would they ever get back to the original statement? And if they would, how would they do it? If this habit of digressing RCM describes as speaking in a Shandian style, after Tristram Shandy, the subject of Lawrence Stern's 9-volume 18th century novel, The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman. Now, RKM was a dedicated Shandian. His book, On the Shoulders of Giants, is full of digressions. Indeed, the subtitle is A Shandian Postscript. It deals with the origins of the aphorism, if I have seen farther, it's because I have stood on the shoulders of giants. Now, most of you think that this should be attributed to Isaac Newton. It's wrong, as RKM demonstrated. Read the book. What accounts for their shared impulse to digress? Is it influence, imitation, a totally independent practice, both enjoying following down the paths of their thoughts wherever they take them? We can't say, but it's unusual enough to comment on. Now, another verbal aspect we want to comment on is the term Mertonian. You probably know that eponymy, that is naming an effect or an equation, or at the most extreme, an era like Freudian or the Darwinian era, is the most significant reward scientists can get. Svi told me not long ago that RCM's admirers are called Mertonians. And he asked me if RKM had admirers, and were they called Mertonians? I said, yes, of course. That led me to remember that the Oxford English Dictionary, the definitive history of the English language, has a listing on the word Mertonian. It says, from the proper name of Robert King Merton, 1910 to 2003, U.S. sociologist and humanist, regarded as the founder of the sociology of science. The first use of Mertonian, according to the OED in this sense, appeared in print in 1960. The OED goes on to say, it is still in current use. Now, Svi and I await a revision of the OED that will record the adjective and that it now applies to individuals and ideas associated with Robert C. Merton. So much for Mertonians, because we have more coming. There are 4 Roberts Merton. You may have noted that RCM is not RKM Jr. RKM would never have named his male offspring Jr. Too ordinary and unacceptably self-referential. Now, according to RKM, he never told RCM why he was not RKM Jr. Being obvious was not his style. He wanted to give RCM a puzzle to solve. And RCM did. When RCM telephoned his father to report the birth of his first son, he declared that the baby would be called Robert Frederick, and said no more. Now, Robert F. has his own son, and he is Robert A., born too late to have been in this picture. RCM, RKM, RFM, and that's Robert A. over there. We now have 4 Roberts Merton, and the possibilities for confusion multiply as each new generation comes into the world. RCM has been confused with RKM. I was sent a textbook that dealt with RKM's work, and his picture is in the textbook. RCM's picture is in the textbook. Now, when RKM encountered a colleague at Columbia at an elevator who said, "Oh, Bob, I had no idea you knew so much mathematics." Now, even I've been gotten into the picture because Bob, the American Philosophical Society is determined that you and I have been co-authors. Now that's wonderful, but it's complete fiction. And finally, we turn to their signatures. You see, I'm at MIT, but my hand doesn't go along with my mind. Help. There we are. Here are the two signatures. We asked RCM about the origin of his signature with the leftward curled underscore. And he didn't clearly he didn't know what we were talking about. RKM's Bob, that is taken from a letter to Zvi, where he just calls himself Bob the Elder, goes back many decades, but so does RCM's. That RCM was puzzled by our question suggests that he wasn't aware of the similarity. But how could that be? Was it unconscious imitation? How did those signatures come about? We can't say. Are signatures coded in the genes? We don't think so. We leave the mystery of similarity to you to solve. RCM has said how much it pleases him that when he types Robert Merton into Google, his father's name, not his, comes up first. This being a mechanical outcome of the number of queries the Google machinery receives. Now, why does RKM's presence please him so? He responded, well, my father has now been dead for 16 years, and with the Nobel, one might have thought my name would have displaced his, but it hasn't. This pleases RCM because he knows what really mattered to his father. It was that his ideas would live on after him, that they would be of interest to others, not obscure references long since stale and outmoded. RCM knew his father very well. By drawing in his own research on his father's ideas, RCM has shown that those contributions still have value. In doing so, he's also increased the chances that his father's contributions would remain useful as others are stimulated by the ideas his son has used. Paul Samuelson once described RCM and RKM as a worthy son of a worthy father. In our view, they're also a deserving pair. Thank you.